Free will is the one thing you've never questioned. Every choice, every decision, unmistakably yours. Here's what the science actually says. Your decisions are made before you make them. The version of you that feels like it's choosing arrives late, after the decision is already done. Here is what actually happens inside your brain when you think you're making a choice. Free will is not a fact you learned, it's an assumption you were born into. You feel your choices from the inside, immediately, viscerally, undeniably, and that feeling is the most convincing thing about it. Every legal system on earth is built around it. Every moral judgment you've ever made, of yourself or someone else, rests on the belief that people could have chosen differently, that there is a self responsible for what the body does. The belief runs so deep that questioning it feels like questioning whether you exist. If you didn't choose your actions, who did? And here's what makes it almost impossible to reject on instinct. The feeling of deciding is real. No one disputes that. The experience of choosing happens. The only question that matters here, is whether that experience is actually what's driving the behavior, or whether it's a story the brain tells itself after the fact to maintain the sense of authorship over something it didn't initiate. Philosophers have argued about this for over 2,000 years. But for most of that time, the debate stayed in philosophy. Then neuroscience got involved, and once you could measure the brain while a decision was forming, the argument changed permanently. The first hint that something was wrong came from a researcher who asked a deceptively simple question: what if we could measure exactly when a person decides to move, and compare it to when their brain starts preparing to move? It's 1983. Benjamin Libet builds a simple experiment. A subject sits in front of a clock with a rapidly rotating hand. Whenever they feel like it, no cue, no instruction, they flick their wrist. Their only job is to note the exact position of the clock hand the moment they first felt the urge to move. Electrodes measure brain activity the entire time. The experiment runs. The data comes in, and what Libet finds permanently changes the conversation. Before the subject reported any awareness of deciding, before they consciously felt the urge, their brain had already begun. The electrical buildup, called the readiness potential, started 550 milliseconds before the movement. Conscious awareness of the decision didn't appear until 200 milliseconds before the movement, which means the brain was already 350 milliseconds into the process before the person had any sense that a decision was forming at all. Your brain starts the decision. Then, a fraction of a second later, you become aware of deciding. Then you move. The sequence you assumed, thought, then action, was already reversed before you could notice. Libet tried to rescue free will with a veto mechanism. Maybe consciousness can't start a movement, but it can stop one. The window between brain preparation and awareness is where your freedom lives. You can let it happen, or you can block it. But later experiments challenged even that. The decision to cancel a movement was also preceded by neural activity. The veto itself was already in motion before it reached awareness. The scientific community debated the methodology for decades. Was the clock technique accurate? Was a wrist flick too simple to represent real decisions? Did any of this apply outside a laboratory? Those were fair questions, and in 2008, a team at the Max Planck Institute decided to answer them. They placed subjects inside a brain scanner and asked them to choose freely, at any moment with no prompting, whether to press a button with their left hand or their right. A real binary decision. No clock. No wrist flick. And the result didn't just replicate Libet. It made Libet look like an early draft. The researchers found they could predict which hand a subject would choose from patterns of brain activity before the subject had made any conscious decision at all. And they could do it up to 10 seconds before the person became aware of choosing. 10 seconds, not half a second, not a heartbeat, 10 full seconds of unconscious neural preparation, visible in the scanner, already shaping the decision before the decision existed for the person making it. The accuracy was 60%. That sounds modest until you remember that chance is 50, and that the prediction was being made at a moment when the subject was completely unaware that any decision process had started. You weren't the author of the moment. You were the last one to find out about it. The brain regions involved weren't primitive reflex arcs. They were the frontal polar cortex and the precuneus, high-level areas associated with planning, intention, and abstract thought, the parts of the brain most associated with the concept of mind itself. This wasn't evidence that simple motor movements are automatic. This was evidence that the formation of a decision, any decision, may already be underway long before you have any experience of deciding at all. Most people want to pause here and argue. The experiments have critics. The readiness potential may not mean exactly what Libet thought. 60% leaves 40 unaccounted for. Laboratory conditions are artificial. But consider what Robert Sapolsky spent 40 years working toward. Sapolsky is a neurobiologist at Stanford who has studied the biology of human behavior longer than most researchers stay in their careers. And in 2023, he published the full argument. Your choices are not made by some separate self that floats above your biology. There is no such self. There never was. Your choices emerge from your genes, your hormones, your upbringing, your culture, the experiences you had before you were born, what happened to you in the last 5 minutes. Every factor that shaped the current state of your brain, none of which you chose, none of which originated with you. Before Sapolsky, behavioral scientists were already finding the edges. Studies showed that judges give measurably harsher sentences before lunch than after. That how much you pay at a restaurant is influenced by background music you barely noticed. That which candidate you vote for is affected by whether your polling station is in a church or a school. None of those influences appear in your experience of deciding. You feel like you're evaluating options, but the data says something else is driving the wheel. Sapolsky's argument is that this scales all the way up. The way you vote, who you fell in love with, whether you lose your temper, whether you're kind to strangers on a hard day, all of it traceable, in principle, to a cascade of causes you didn't start. And this has implications that reach far past the abstract. Every system of justice on earth is built on the premise that people deserve punishment, that they could have done otherwise, that there is a self, separate from circumstance, that is responsible for what the body does. Sapolsky argues that premise is false, and he points to something that should stop you cold. The history of medicine is, in no small part, the history of removing blame. For centuries, epilepsy was understood as demonic possession. The person having the seizure was held responsible, morally, sometimes legally, for something happening entirely within their neurology, without their awareness, without their consent. We look back at that now and it's obvious. They didn't choose the seizure, but the logic that led people to blame them is structurally identical to the logic we still apply in courtrooms today. If your behavior is always the product of your biology and your history, then the clean line between people who deserve punishment and people who deserve understanding starts to dissolve, not completely, but enough to make you uncomfortable. This is where the vertigo sets in. If I didn't choose, not fully, not in any pure sense, then what am I? What does responsibility mean? And here is the thing about that question. It assumes you and your biology are two separate things, that there is a you that exists apart from the matter doing the deciding. That assumption is worth examining very carefully. Philosophers call this position compatibilism, the view that free will and determinism are not actually in conflict because we've been asking the wrong question all along. The question is not whether your brain fired before you consciously decided. Of course it did. Your brain is not something that happens to you. Your brain is you. There is no version of you that exists outside the physical processes running inside your skull. The question is whether the self doing the deciding, the brain, the history, the full accumulated weight of everything you've ever lived through is meaningfully yours, and it is, because there is no other candidate. There's something worth calling the Sapolsky paradox. Sapolsky spent years carefully weighing evidence, revising his thinking, and concluding that free will doesn't exist. But the act of deliberating, of sitting with evidence long enough to change your mind, is itself a form of exactly the thing he says doesn't exist. If this is the kind of thinking you want more of, make sure you're subscribed. There's a lot more coming. Every time you sit with a difficult idea long enough to shift your position, something real is happening. It may be determined by everything that came before, but it is also unmistakably you. The reframe is not that you have no free will. The reframe is that you are your causes. your genes, your history, your biology. That is not a cage you are locked inside. That is the actual material you are made of. You are not separate from it. You are it. That changes how you judge yourself. Because the harshest judgment you've ever directed at yourself was aimed at a version of you that was already the product of everything before it and could only have done what it did. And it changes how you see other people. Because the worst thing someone has ever done was committed by a person who was also the product of everything before them. That doesn't erase what happened, but it changes what the word deserve actually means. Free will, in the sense most people imagine it, pure, uncaused, originating from a self that exists above biology, probably doesn't exist the way the story goes. But agency, the process of deliberating, weighing, and acting is real. It's just not magic. It's what a complex biological system does when it encounters the world, and it is entirely yours. You are not the author of the first sentence of your story. No one is, but you are the continuation of it. And what you do next is being written right now, in neurons you don't control, by a brain that is completely, irreducibly you. It turns out the smarter you are, the better equipped you are to make the worst possible choices. And the mechanism behind it is not what you'd expect. Subscribe to Kairos. Think sharper, know faster.